My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people think they understand very quickly. A wife, a steady presence, the calm one in the room. I built a life that looked quiet from the outside, stable, supportive, unremarkable, in ways that made others comfortable. I didn't demand attention. I didn't correct people when they underestimated me. I let assumptions pass without resistance. People often mistake restraint for lack of depth. They confuse softness with fragility. And when a woman loves openly, especially within a marriage, there's a certain way society decides her story is already written. That she's chosen security over ambition. That devotion means dependence. That if she's not loud about her worth, she must not have much of it. For a long time, my marriage was treated like an accessory to my identity, rather than the result of conscious choice and sustained effort. I was told, sometimes as a joke, sometimes with a smile that lingered too long, that it wasn't serious. That it was safe, predictable, almost small. I didn't argue. I didn't defend it. I didn't realize then that silence can be misinterpreted as agreement. This story isn't about proving anyone wrong in public. It isn't about dramatic turning points or sudden empowerment. There's no villain here shouting cruel lines, no moment where everything explodes into clarity. What unfolded happened slowly, in private, across months and then years. It happened while I was listening, watching, learning what people revealed when they thought I wasn't paying attention. You'll hear about how I was seen and how that perception shaped the role I was quietly assigned. You'll hear about the first small moments of dismissal that most people would forget, and why I didn't. You'll hear about the strange power of being underestimated, and how invisibility can create room to move without resistance. I want to be clear about something from the beginning. This is not a revenge story. I didn't set out to dominate anyone. I didn't win by humiliating my husband or anyone else who doubted me. What happened was more subtle and more final than that. I built something of my own, not to be admired, but to be grounded. And when the results became visible, admiration followed naturally, without being requested. There is no bitterness in this telling, only honesty, about what it feels like to be mocked for loving deeply, about how quiet endurance can turn into quiet authority, about how a woman can outgrow the version of herself others find convenient, without ever raising her voice. By the end of this story, my life looked very different from how it began. Not because I demanded change, but because I chose it, carefully, deliberately, and without announcement. If you've ever been underestimated because you stayed calm, stayed kind, stayed quiet, have you ever wondered what might happen if you stopped explaining yourself and simply kept building? For most people in my life, I existed in a very specific frame. I was Evelyn, the wife. Not Evelyn the thinker, not Evelyn the builder, just the wife. When I entered a room with my husband, conversations flowed around me rather than toward me. People were polite, warm even. They asked surface questions, how work was going, whether I was keeping busy, and whether we were thinking about children yet. The kind of questions that assume your life is an extension of someone else's timeline. I answered calmly, briefly. I didn't correct the assumptions because at the time, I didn't see them as dangerous. I thought visibility would come naturally with time. That if I continued being reliable, thoughtful, and present, people would eventually notice depth. What I didn't understand then was that people rarely update their first impression unless forced to. To them, I was agreeable, dependable, emotionally soft, the one who would adapt. At dinners, I was the one clearing plates while conversations intensified at the table. At gatherings, I was the listener people vented to, never the one whose opinions redirected the room. At work events connected to my husband's career, I was introduced with a smile that said, "She's lovely," and nothing more. No one was cruel, that's important to say. Cruelty would have been easier to identify. Instead, it was a consistent, quiet minimization. I noticed how jokes landed, how comments slipped through unchallenged, how admiration was distributed unevenly, and how easily people assumed I was satisfied with being adjacent to importance rather than creating it. And I played my part well. I didn't interrupt. I didn't compete. I didn't assert myself in spaces where assertiveness wasn't invited. I told myself I was choosing peace. That confidence didn't need performance. That substance would speak when it mattered. But over time, I began to realize something unsettling. They weren't waiting to hear me. They had already decided. In their story, I had a stable background, emotional support, a constant but not a force. Someone who made things smoother for others without altering the direction of anything. Even my marriage was framed this way. People spoke about it lightly, as if love that didn't demand attention must not be ambitious, as if choosing commitment meant opting out of personal evolution. I remember overhearing someone say, half joking, "Evelyn's life is already sorted." As though being married meant my growth had concluded. I smiled when I heard that. I didn't yet know how deeply that assumption would shape what came next. Inside, I was observant, quietly analytical. I remembered who spoke over me, who dismissed certain ideas when they thought they came from me, but praised the same thoughts when repeated by someone else. I noticed patterns, how respect was granted not by integrity, but by perceived leverage. Still, I didn't resist, because at that stage, I still believed being underestimated was neutral. I hadn't yet learned it could be useful. To them, I was predictable, comfortable, unthreatening. They thought they knew my limits because I never displayed them. And in truth, I let them believe that. Not out of fear, not out of submission, but because I hadn't yet decided who I needed to become. Looking back, that version of me wasn't weak. She was incomplete. She hadn't learned that invisibility isn't just something that happens to you. It's something others depend on you maintaining. And when you stop fulfilling that expectation, everything begins to shift. At the time, though, I didn't know that yet. I only knew that I was being seen as less than the sum of my parts, and that no one around me seemed particularly interested in discovering the rest. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't loud. That's what made it dangerous. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those social gatherings that blend together over the years. Nothing formal. A few colleagues of my husband, their partners, glasses of wine that loosen conversation, just enough for honesty to slip out, disguised as humor. I remember where I was standing, near the kitchen counter, half listening, half observing, the way I often did. Someone was telling a story about ambition, about sacrifices, long hours, real pressure. My husband laughed and nodded along. Then someone turned slightly toward me and said, smiling, "Well, not everyone needs that kind of drive." It wasn't said unkindly. That's the part people miss. There was a pause afterward, brief, just long enough for the comment to settle before the conversation moved on. No one objected, no one clarified, not even my husband. The moment passed, absorbed into the noise of the evening as if it had never existed. But I felt it, not as anger, not even as hurt, more like a nick in glass. Small, barely visible, but irreversible. I smiled because that's what I always did. I refilled someone's drink. I asked a question that redirected attention away from me. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something registered. That was the first time I realized how casually people define me, and how little effort it took. The comment followed an unspoken logic I had encountered before but never fully examined. That is because I loved my marriage, because I didn't pursue ambition publicly, because I didn't narrate my inner world, and I must not possess one worth considering. What struck me most was not the assumption itself, but the confidence behind it. They weren't guessing, they were concluding. Later that night, after everyone left, I mentioned it lightly to my husband. Not accusingly, just curiously. I asked if he had noticed. He frowned for a moment, trying to recall the comment, then shrugged. I don't think they meant anything by it. That sentence did more damage than the comment itself, because it told me something important. If I felt diminished quietly, it wouldn't register as harm. Not to him, not to anyone else. It would be categorized as sensitivity, overthinking, something I should manage internally rather than address externally. So I did what I had been trained to do. I managed it. I told myself I was being dramatic. That is not every moment required interpretation. That people speak loosely. That love means letting small things go. And I did let it go, on the surface. But I started noticing how often these small cuts appeared. How often I was framed as supportive instead of capable. how my choices were described as preferences rather than decisions, how my calmness invited projection. People filled the silence around me with assumptions that suited them. Each moment on its own was forgettable. Together, they formed a pattern. What unsettled me was how invisible the pattern was to everyone else. To them, nothing was happening. To me, something was accumulating. I didn't confront anyone, not because I lacked courage, but because I was beginning to sense that confrontation would only reinforce the image they already had. Emotional, defensive, reactive. Instead, I watched. I started paying attention to what people respected and what they dismissed, how authority was perceived, how competence was recognized only when it disrupted expectations. And slowly, a quiet question began forming in my mind. What would happen if I stopped correcting their misunderstandings? What if I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe, while I learned everything they didn't think I was capable of understanding? At the time, I didn't label this as a strategy. It didn't feel calculated. It felt like self-preservation, like stepping back from a room to see its architecture more clearly. I was still loving, still present, still reliable, but something inside me had shifted its weight. The first small cut didn't make me bleed. It made me aware that dismissal doesn't always arrive as hostility, aware that respect is often withheld quietly, aware that people reveal their true assessments when they think there will be no consequence. Everyone else forgot that moment by the end of the night. I carried it with me, not as resentment, as data. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way certain tones repeat, in the way people speak around you instead of to you, in the way your presence becomes functional rather than influential. After that first small cut, nothing outwardly changed in my life. My marriage continued, my routine stayed intact. I still showed up to gatherings, still listened, still smoothed edges. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. But internally, I had started measuring moments instead of dismissing them. The comments kept coming, not cruel enough to protest, not obvious enough to confront. "You're so easygoing, I envy that." "You don't really care about status, do you?" "I wish I could be as content as you." Each one sounded like a compliment, and each one carried an assumption that I was finished, that my ambitions were either small or non-existent, that my inner world had already reached its final shape. I nodded, I smiled. I let people believe what they needed to believe. At first, I rationalized it. I told myself that being underestimated was harmless, that people projecting onto me wasn't my responsibility, that not everyone needed to know my depth. I even took a quiet pride in being the calm one, the emotionally regulated one, while others scrambled for recognition. But normalization is powerful. When something happens repeatedly without consequence, it stops registering as wrong. I noticed how often decisions were made in my presence without my input, how plans were adjusted, assuming my flexibility rather than asking for my preference, how my time was treated as expandable. And because I rarely objected, the behavior solidified. In my marriage, this showed up subtly too. My husband wasn't unkind. He wasn't dismissive in the way people imagine dismissal. He simply assumed I would adapt, that my needs were fluid, that my priorities aligned seamlessly with his because I loved him. And I did love him. So I told myself this was a partnership. That compromise was maturity. That not every imbalance was an injustice. But there's a difference between compromise and erasure. I remember one specific moment, standing in our kitchen, discussing a decision that affected both of us. I offered an alternative, calmly, thoughtfully. He paused, then said, "That seems complicated. Let's just do what makes sense." What he meant was, what made sense to him. I let it go, again. I didn't fight because I wasn't yet ready to admit how often my perspective was being categorized as optional. How my calmness had trained people to believe I had no breaking point. The most dangerous part of normalized disrespect is that it doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like a misunderstanding. And misunderstanding feels fixable if you're patient enough, kind enough, clear enough. So I became more patient, more kind, more clear, and still nothing shifted, because the issue was never my communication. It was the role I had been placed in. Reliable, supportive, emotionally stable, and therefore ignorable. What kept me quiet wasn't fear. It was hope. Hope that consistency would eventually be rewarded, that people would wake up and realize I was more than the version they had grown comfortable with, but comfort resists disruption. I began to understand that my silence wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. People depended on it. It made their lives smoother. It confirmed their narratives. And as long as I continued absorbing the weight without protest, there was no incentive for anyone to change. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I stopped explaining myself unnecessarily. I stopped offering insights into spaces that didn't value them. I started noticing how often people revealed their assumptions when they thought I wasn't tracking them. And in that quiet observation, something important happened. I stopped trying to be understood. Instead, I started trying to understand. Because once disrespect becomes normal, the question is no longer, why is this happening? The question becomes, what am I going to do with this information? At the time, I still didn't act, but I was no longer unaware. And awareness, once established, doesn't go away. It took time for me to name the role I had been given, because roles like mine don't come with titles. They come with expectations. I was expected to remember everything, to adjust my schedule, to absorb tension without redirecting it, to be emotionally available without requiring reciprocity, to be present without being prominent. And because I fulfilled those expectations so consistently, they hardened into identity. In group settings, I was the one people leaned on but didn't lean toward, the one trusted with details but excluded from decisions. I was consulted after choices were made, not before. Included in logistics, not in direction. No one ever said, your voice doesn't matter. They didn't need to. The structure of interaction said it for them. What unsettled me most was how natural it all felt. To them. How easily people relied on my reliability. How comfortable they were assuming my flexibility. How rarely anyone checked whether I wanted to be the person who held everything together quietly. At some point, I realized something uncomfortable. This role only existed because I kept performing it. In my marriage, the pattern was even clearer. I managed emotional labor without naming it. I anticipated needs. I smoothed transitions. I was the one who remembered what mattered and when it mattered. And because I did these things without complaint, they became invisible. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being indispensable. People don't see the effort. They only notice the absence of friction. I remember sitting across from my husband one evening, listening to him talk about stress, deadlines, and pressure. I offered support, insight, perspective. He nodded, appreciative, then moved on. Later, when he spoke about the same issue to someone else, he repeated my words almost exactly. This time, they were praised, labeled smart, practical. I watched it happen without reacting, not because I didn't care, but because I was beginning to understand how value was assigned. It wasn't about the idea, it was about the source, and I had already been categorized. In this role, I wasn't expected to grow beyond it. Growth would have disrupted the ecosystem. My steadiness was useful, my silence was convenient. So when I started changing internally, reading differently, thinking differently, questioning quietly, no one noticed. They couldn't imagine me becoming something else because they had never needed me to. That realization didn't hurt the way the small cuts had. It clarified. I saw how roles are rarely imposed aggressively. They are shaped gently, through repetition, through what is rewarded and what is ignored. And once established, they become self-sustaining. Breaking out of a role like mine would have required disruption, explanation, emotional labor I was no longer willing to provide. So instead I stayed inside it. I continued being calm, being reliable, being present. But I stopped giving away parts of myself for free. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fill. I stopped volunteering insight where it wasn't requested. I stopped cushioning other people's discomfort. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, I had stepped back from the role without announcing my exit. And that created space. Space to observe how quickly people took my labor for granted. Space to see what happened when I didn't rush to smooth things over. Space to recognize that my invisibility wasn't an accident. It was a function. Once you see the role clearly, you can decide whether to keep playing it. I hadn't decided yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. I was done being invisible by default. There wasn't an argument, no breaking point, no dramatic moment where everything came into focus at once. The shift happened quietly, on a day that looked like any other. I was alone, sitting in a cafe I visited often. Same corner table, same neutral background noise. I had brought a notebook with me, not for planning, not for journaling, just to think, to sit with my own thoughts without needing to turn them into something useful for someone else. I remember watching people come and go, each absorbed in their own urgency. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't scanning the room for cues. I wasn't anticipating anyone's needs. I wasn't managing emotional space. I was just there. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced, not as a question, but as a statement. Nothing is going to change unless I change it. Not them, not the dynamics, not the roles. Me. I realized that I had been waiting to be seen, waiting for recognition to arrive organically, waiting for someone to notice the imbalance and correct it out of fairness. That waiting had kept me suspended in a version of myself that no longer fit. What struck me wasn't anger, it was fatigue. A deep, quiet exhaustion from carrying a version of myself that made other people comfortable, while slowly shrinking my own sense of agency. I didn't feel betrayed, I felt awake. I understood then that love doesn't require self-erasure, that loyalty doesn't mean permanence at any cost, that patience, when it becomes habitual, can turn into avoidance, and most importantly, that silence can either be submission or choice. Until that day, mine had been the former, without intention, without direction. I closed the notebook without writing anything. I didn't make promises to myself. I didn't vow to leave or confront or rebuild. I didn't even know what action would look like yet. But I made one internal decision that changed everything. I would no longer explain my inner world to people who had already decided it didn't matter. From that moment on, my silence became deliberate. Not cold, not resentful. Precise. I stopped narrating my feelings in real time. I stopped seeking validation for thoughts I trusted. I began to let others sit with their assumptions without correcting them, and something unexpected happened. The less I explained, the more room I had to think. The less I reacted, the more clearly I saw patterns. The more clearly I saw patterns, the less personal everything felt. What I had mistaken for disregard was often inertia. People continued treating me the way I allowed them to, because it worked. It required no adjustment from them. I didn't blame them for that, but I stopped participating. That day wasn't the beginning of action. It was the beginning of alignment. My thoughts, my observations, my future decisions began lining up quietly behind the same internal axis. I wasn't building anything yet. I wasn't dismantling anything either. I was repositioning, and repositioning doesn't announce itself. From the outside, I was still Evelyn, calm, reliable, predictable. Inside, I had stopped waiting to be recognized. I had started preparing to move. When silence becomes intentional, it changes texture. It's no longer something that happens to you. It's something you use. After that day, I didn't withdraw from my life. I didn't become distant or cold. I showed up the same way I always had, on time, composed, attentive. If anything, I became easier to be around. And that was the problem. People mistook my quiet focus for passivity. Because I no longer explained myself, others filled in the gaps with their own conclusions. They assumed I was agreeable, unambitious, still adaptable, still available. I let them. At home, my husband noticed small changes, but he couldn't quite name them. I wasn't asking as many questions. I wasn't offering as many suggestions. When decisions were made without me, I accepted them without discussion. To him, this felt like harmony. To me, it felt like clarity. I was listening in a different way now, not for emotional cues, but for structural ones. I noticed how authority was exercised, how resources were allocated, how decisions were framed as inevitable rather than chosen. And I stopped volunteering my labor into systems that didn't credit it. When people talked over me, I didn't interrupt. When my ideas were ignored, I didn't repeat them. When assumptions were made about my availability, I didn't correct them. This wasn't withdrawal, it was containment. I was conserving energy, information, intention. Silence, when chosen, becomes a filter. It shows you who expects access to you without earning it. It reveals who is uncomfortable when you stop cushioning their uncertainty. Some people leaned harder. They spoke more. They filled the space nervously, as if trying to provoke a response that never came. Others barely noticed. That told me everything. At work, I began documenting instead of discussing. I tracked patterns, outcomes, and contributions. I learned quietly about systems, about leverage, about how progress is measured in rooms I wasn't invited into. No one thought to ask what I was doing. Why would they? I was still playing my role, just without the extras. There's a particular power in being underestimated while you're no longer seeking approval. You stop reacting emotionally to moments that once felt personal. You start seeing them as signals. I didn't feel superior. I felt detached in a grounded way, because for the first time, my silence wasn't protecting other people's comfort. It was protecting my future. The irony is that when you stop over-explaining, people often assume you have nothing to say. When you stop reacting, they assume you have nothing at stake. That assumption gave me freedom. Freedom to plan without interference. Freedom to learn without scrutiny. Freedom to change direction without negotiation. I didn't correct their misunderstanding. I let it mature. Because the moment you reveal you're changing, people try to slow you down, not out of malice, but out of habit. They want you to remain legible. I had no interest in being legible anymore. By the time anyone noticed that my silence had shifted from softness to solidity, I was already several steps ahead. They thought I was still standing still. I wasn't. What most people miss about quiet people is not that we don't act. It's that we act without narration. While everyone else was busy interpreting my silence as compliance, I was building structure beneath the surface. Not hastily, not dramatically, methodically. I started by learning, not in ways that were visible or performative. I didn't announce new goals. I didn't ask for advice from people who had already underestimated me. I read, I listened, I observed how systems worked when emotions were removed from the equation. I learned about financial frameworks, about ownership, about how stability is actually created, not through optimism, but through positioning. I learned what questions to ask, and more importantly, when not to ask them out loud. No one noticed because no one expected me to. At home, routines continued. I was still present, still supportive, still predictable in all the ways that mattered to others. That predictability became camouflage. People rarely look closely at what feels familiar. I began documenting everything, not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. Contributions, patterns, decisions, timelines. I treated my own life like a case study, removing emotion just enough to see cause and effect. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. I also began rebuilding my internal identity. I quietly separated who I was from the role I had been assigned. I stopped thinking of myself primarily as someone's partner, someone's support system, someone's stabilizer. I thought of myself as an operator, someone who understands systems, someone who moves deliberately, someone who doesn't need validation to proceed. The more I learned, the less urgency I felt. Knowledge has a grounding effect when you know you don't need to reveal it immediately. I didn't feel the need to correct misconceptions anymore because those misconceptions were actively working in my favor. They thought I wasn't paying attention. I was paying attention to everything. I noticed who controlled resources and who merely managed outcomes. I noticed how often people conflated confidence with competence. I noticed how decisions were justified after the fact to appear inevitable, and I noticed how often my quiet presence was treated as neutral, never as strategic. That miscalculation gave me time to strengthen without resistance, time to plan without interference, time to decide what kind of future I actually wanted. I didn't rush. Rushing would have revealed intention, and intention invites scrutiny. Instead, I let my preparation be boring, invisible, easy to ignore. There were moments of loneliness in this phase, not because I was isolated, but because growth without witnesses is inherently solitary. There was no applause, no reassurance. No one was telling me I was doing the right thing, but I trusted my process. I trusted the version of myself that had finally stopped asking for permission. What they never noticed was that I was no longer invested in being seen as good or easy or supportive. I was invested in being accurate. Accurate about my needs, accurate about my leverage, accurate about what staying would cost me, and what leaving might require. By the time the pieces began to come together, my emotional attachment to the old version of my life had already loosened. I wasn't fantasizing about escape. I was preparing for independence. And preparation, done quietly, is almost always mistaken for inertia. The moment I understood what I had wasn't triumphant. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, just a stillness that settled deep in my chest. I remember sitting alone at my desk late one evening, documents spread out in front of me. Nothing dramatic, just numbers, timelines, legal language. The kind of material most people skim, assuming it's someone else's responsibility to understand. But I understood it fully, and in that understanding, something clicked into place. I saw with sudden clarity how much of my life had been built on assumptions. Other people's assumptions about my limits, my dependence, my willingness to stay quiet. I also saw how those same assumptions had created gaps. Gaps in oversight, gaps in attention, gaps in expectation. And inside those gaps was leverage. Not leverage in a manipulative sense. Not something to be exploited recklessly, but leverage that came from preparation, from accuracy, from having done the work no one thought I was capable of doing. I realized I had options. Real ones. Not fantasies about starting over or vague hopes that things might improve. Concrete paths forward, each with costs, each with consequences, each requiring resolve. What surprised me most wasn't the power of those options. It was how calm I felt holding them. I didn't feel the need to tell anyone. Not my friends, not my husband, not even myself in words. The knowledge settled quietly, like a weight finding its center of gravity. This was mine. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to circumstances. I was positioned within them. I didn't rush to act because I didn't need to. The moment you know you can leave, or change, or rebuild, urgency dissolves. You stop negotiating from fear. You stop over-explaining. You start choosing. That night I closed the documents and cleaned my desk. I went to bed at a normal hour. I slept deeply. The next morning, nothing looked different. My marriage was the same. My routines were the same. The way people spoke to me was unchanged. And yet, everything had shifted. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew I wasn't trapped. I knew I wasn't powerless. I knew my silence was no longer a liability. It was a boundary. From that moment on, every interaction was filtered through that private clarity. I listened differently. I agreed more selectively. I gave less of myself away unconsciously. I wasn't waiting for the right time anymore. I was watching for the right alignment. There was no joy in this realization, only steadiness. A sense of internal balance I hadn't felt in years. I didn't need to announce anything. The reveal had already happened, just not publicly. It happened inside me. And once something shifts internally, the external world eventually has to adjust. It just doesn't know it yet. Having options doesn't force a decision. It delays it. Once I knew what I was capable of doing, what paths were available to me, I didn't rush toward any of them. I lived for a while in the space between knowing and choosing. That space is quieter than people imagine. There's no panic in it, no thrill, just wait, because every option asks something of you. Staying meant accepting that the structure of my marriage would likely remain unchanged, that I would continue being valued for stability rather than vision, that I would have to make peace with being essential but not influential. Leaving meant something else entirely. It meant dismantling a life that looked intact from the outside. It meant discomfort, misinterpretation, and silence from people who would never ask what it cost me to stay. It meant being willing to be misunderstood without rushing to correct the narrative. There were also paths in between: renegotiation, recalibration, careful conversations. I considered them seriously. I played them out mentally, step by step, imagining how they would unfold. And in every version I saw the same pattern. I would be asked to explain, to justify, to soften. I would be required to make my inner clarity legible to people who had benefited from not seeing it. That was the moment I understood the real choice wasn't about marriage. It was about irreversibility. Staying would keep me legible to others, but fragmented internally. Leaving would make me whole, but illegible for a while. I thought about the woman I was becoming, about the quiet precision that had replaced my earlier hopefulness, about how grounded I felt when I stopped performing reassurance. And I asked myself a question I hadn't asked before. Which version of my life requires me to shrink in order to function? The answer was immediate. So I chose the path that couldn't be undone. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't even emotionally dramatize it for myself. I simply stopped investing in futures that required my silence as a condition. The decision didn't feel brave. It felt aligned. From that point on, every action I took was guided by that choice, even though no one around me knew it had been made. I was still present, still calm, still cooperative in all the ways that made others comfortable. But internally, I had crossed a line. Once you decide on something irreversible, your posture changes. You stop negotiating with imagined outcomes. You stop hoping for external validation. You move forward because there's nowhere else you're willing to stand. That was the moment my future became unavoidable. Not because I forced it, but because I stopped delaying it. After the decision was made, there was no rush. Urgency is a signal, and signals attract attention. I moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for consequences. Real change isn't loud. It's procedural. It's a series of small, precise actions that look ordinary when viewed individually. I handled logistics quietly. I organized information. I prepared documentation. I sought professional guidance without announcing it to anyone who didn't need to know. Every step was deliberate. Every choice is reversible only until it isn't. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. I still showed up, still listened, still participated in routines that had always defined me. I didn't withdraw affection or create emotional distance. I simply stopped over-investing in explanations. This phase required discipline. There were moments when it would have been easier to speak, to warn, to explain myself early in hopes of softening what was coming. But that would have shifted the balance prematurely. When you move in silence, you're not hiding. You're protecting alignment. I learned how many systems are built on assumptions of continuity, assumptions that someone will always be there to absorb friction. As long as those assumptions held, no one questioned the structure. So I let them hold. I handled my affairs with a level of care that surprised even me. Not because it was complicated, but because it demanded emotional restraint. There is something grounding about choosing precision over impulse. Each step strengthened my position, not against anyone, but for myself. I didn't feel secretive. I felt respectful of the process. What no one noticed was how much I had already disengaged from seeking permission. I wasn't asking for approval anymore, because I wasn't planning to negotiate. The work happened in quiet spaces, off hours, private meetings, moments carved out of routine. No dramatic calendar changes, no sudden absences. And because nothing seemed different, no one looked closer. That's the paradox of silence. People only become curious when something feels unstable. I made sure everything felt stable. By the time the foundation was set, the future was already in motion. And still, no one noticed. Not because they were inattentive, because they trusted the version of me that had never disrupted anything before. I let that trust remain intact. It made the next phase inevitable. The first consequences didn't announce themselves. They arrived as absences, not dramatic ones. Not the kind of people who point to and say, something is wrong. These were subtler. Missed expectations, delays where there used to be ease, small frictions no one knew how to name. At first, people assumed it was temporary. A busy week, a phase, a misunderstanding. I noticed it immediately. I noticed how often I was no longer available to absorb emotional overflow. How conversations that once flowed easily now stall. Decisions took longer because no one was quietly aligning everything behind the scenes. At home, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate. My husband seemed unsettled, not angry, not confrontational, just off balance. He asked more questions, checked in more often. There was a subtle uncertainty in his tone, as if he could sense that something foundational had moved, but couldn't locate it. "What's going on with you lately?" he asked one evening casually. I smiled. "Nothing, why?" "I don't know," he said. "You just seem different." I let the word hang there. Different didn't mean distant. It didn't mean cold. It meant unavailable in ways he had never needed to notice before. What he was experiencing wasn't rejection. It was the absence of invisible labor, the kind that makes life feel seamless when it's present and disorienting when it's gone. Outside our marriage, the same pattern appeared. People reached out more frequently, not with concern, but with confusion. They asked questions that assumed I would fill gaps, smooth transitions, and clarify misunderstandings. And for the first time, I didn't rush to do it. Not out of spite, out of alignment. I responded when it was appropriate. I declined when it wasn't. I stopped compensating for systems that had never credited my contribution. The discomfort wasn't loud, but it spread. People began to feel the cost of my absence without knowing how to attribute it. And because they had never acknowledged my role when it was active, they struggled to name it when it disappeared. This is what happens when someone has been quietly holding the structure together. When they step back, the structure doesn't collapse. It wobbles, and wobbling creates anxiety. I didn't correct anyone's interpretation. I didn't step in to reassure them that everything was fine. I let the natural consequences unfold at their own pace, not to teach a lesson, but because I was no longer responsible for preventing discomfort at my own expense. There was a strange calm in this phase, Not satisfied, not vindication, just confirmation. Confirmation that what I had contributed all along had been real, even if it had gone unrecognized. Confirmation that my silence had once been misread and was now being felt. I wasn't trying to be missed. I was simply no longer compensating for being overlooked. And that changed everything. By the time people realized something fundamental had changed, they were already behind it. That's the nature of quiet shifts. They don't give warnings. They don't escalate gradually. They simply cross a threshold. And once crossed, the old mechanisms stop working. The tone around me changed. Questions turned into concern. Concern turned into urgency. People began revisiting old conversations, searching for the moment they must have missed. They tried to locate a specific mistake, a single turning point they could address and correct. There wasn't one. At home, my husband's confusion hardened into something closer to panic. Not explosive, not dramatic, but persistent. He tried to re-engage in ways that would have worked before. More conversation, more attention, occasional gestures meant to reassure. But gestures aren't the same as recalibration. He asked me if I was unhappy. I considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm not confused anymore," I said. That was the most honest response I could give. What he felt wasn't abandonment. It was the destabilization of an assumption that I would always be there to absorb uncertainty, to adapt quietly, to stay legible. Once that assumption broke, there was no simple way to restore it. Outside our marriage, the same dynamic played out. People expressed surprise that I had changed. They framed it as sudden, as if the shift had happened overnight. They asked what they could do to fix things, without fully understanding what things meant. They were reacting to the loss of access, not to the reality of my experience. And because they were late to the process, they defaulted to urgency. Urgency creates pressure. Pressure seeks shortcuts. There were attempts to reframe me back into my old role. Compliments about my calmness, reminders of how easy I was to work with, subtle suggestions that I was overcomplicating things. None of it landed. Not because I was hardened, because I was no longer undecided. Once clarity settles in, confusion from others loses its power. You can see it for what it is. Discomfort with change, not evidence of your wrongdoing. I didn't argue, I didn't defend. I listened, the way I always had. But I no longer interpreted listening as agreement. What people were asking for wasn't resolution. It was a restoration, and restoration would have required me to step back into a version of myself I had already outgrown. That wasn't an option, not because I was unwilling to compromise, but because compromise without recognition is just delayed erosion. By the time they realized something couldn't be undone, the opportunity to prevent it had already passed. Not out of malice, out of neglect. And neglect doesn't reverse itself just because it's finally noticed. The conversation everyone expects, the dramatic one, rarely looks the way it's imagined. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no moment where I unloaded years of silence all at once. When it finally happened, it was almost understated. We were sitting across from each other, the way we had countless times before. Same table, same familiar space. What was different was the absence of tension in my body. I wasn't bracing, I wasn't rehearsing, I wasn't hoping for a particular outcome. That alone changed the dynamic. My husband spoke first. He talked about distance, about feeling unsure, about not knowing where he stood with me anymore. His words were careful, searching, as if he were trying to locate the version of me he remembered. I let him finish. Then I spoke, not emotionally, not defensively, but clearly. I didn't disappear, I said. I stopped compensating. The sentence landed quietly between us. I explained, not everything, just enough. I didn't recount every slight or replay every dismissal. I didn't dramatize the past. I described patterns, roles, expectations that had formed without being questioned. I told him that for a long time, I had been present in a way that made things easier for everyone else and smaller for me. He tried to interrupt, to reassure me that he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he valued me. I nodded. I believe that, I said, but intention isn't the same as structure. That was the moment he understood, at least partially, that this wasn't about feelings that could be soothed. It was about a system that had been running quietly for years. There was no anger in the room, just a growing recognition that something had shifted beyond repair. He asked what I wanted, and for the first time, I didn't answer with something flexible. I want a life where I don't have to disappear in order for things to work, I said. There was a long pause. Not because he was angry, because he was realizing that whatever came next wouldn't be resolved by promises or effort alone. I didn't ask him to change. I didn't demand understanding. I stated where I stood. That was the confrontation, not heat, not conflict, but clarity. When you speak from alignment instead of pain, there's nothing to escalate. The conversation doesn't spiral. It simply reaches its limit. And once that limit is reached, pretending otherwise becomes impossible. I left that conversation knowing I had been honest without being cruel, calm without being cold, firm without being punitive. That mattered to me, because dominance, when it's quiet, doesn't need to prove itself. It just stands. The version of me that exists now doesn't feel like a reaction to the past. She feels like a continuation that was delayed. I'm no longer moving in contrast to who I was before. I'm moving from her, carrying what was true, releasing what was learned under pressure. What's changed most is not my life structure, but my internal posture. I no longer explain myself preemptively. I no longer translate my clarity into palatable language for other people. I no longer equate calm with accommodation. There's a steadiness in me now that doesn't come from certainty about outcomes, but from trust in my own discernment. People experience me differently. Some find me more reserved. Others say I seem grounded. A few are unsettled, not because I'm unkind, but because I no longer soften my presence to keep others comfortable. I don't mind that. I've learned that being respected and being liked are not always aligned, and choosing one consistently over the other shapes your life in very different ways. I still value connection. I still listen carefully. I still care deeply, but I no longer disappear inside those things. My work is more intentional now. I choose environments where contribution is visible and credited, where silence is interpreted as thought, not absence, where alignment matters more than optics. I don't chase admiration. When it comes, it's usually quiet, delayed recognition from people who once overlooked me. Not because I demanded it, but because results have a way of reordering perception. That admiration doesn't define me. What defines me is coherence. My inner life and outer actions no longer contradict each other. I don't feel the need to perform ease or swallow discomfort in the name of harmony. I allow tension to exist if it's honest. There's no bitterness here. I don't regret the woman I was. She taught me how much strength can exist inside patience and how dangerous it can be when left unexamined. I don't carry resentment toward the people who misunderstood me. Most of them were responding to the version of me I presented. What I carry now is responsibility. Responsibility for not returning to a life that requires self-erasure. Responsibility for choosing clarity over comfort. Responsibility for building a future that doesn't depend on being underestimated. This version of me isn't louder. She's more exact, and that has made all the difference. There's a misconception that stories like this end with triumph, with applause, with recognition that arrives right on time. But real closure is quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself as victory. It settles in as relief. Relief from the constant need to explain. Relief from shrinking to preserve harmony. Relief from waiting to be seen by people who had already decided who you were. If there's one truth I've learned, it's this. Being underestimated is not the injury. Staying there is. Most people don't mean to overlook you. They respond to the version of you that feels easiest to understand. When you are calm, adaptable, loving, they assume you will always be so, without cost. And when you pay that cost quietly, they don't learn what it was worth. Quiet dominance doesn't come from withholding love or becoming hardened. It comes from choosing alignment over approval, from letting your life reflect your values without asking permission. I didn't build an empire to prove anyone wrong. I built it because I needed a life that could hold me without requiring disappearance. When admiration came later, as it often does, it felt secondary, almost irrelevant, because by then, I was no longer measuring my worth through other people's awareness. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It was accuracy about my limits, accuracy about my leverage, accuracy about what staying silent was costing me, and what leaving silence behind could create. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't owe the world constant access to your softness. You don't owe anyone the version of you that made their life easier while making yours smaller. And you don't need to announce your transformation for it to be real. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens when you stop explaining and start building. I'm curious, have you ever realized too late or just in time that staying quiet was protecting others more than it was protecting you? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.